All right, so LaTasha, thanks for being here. I appreciate you coming on the show today.
Absolutely, my pleasure. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Oh, me too, me too. And I'd like to actually get started with your story on beginning in the delivery room, because you were pregnant. You know, it's time to give birth. You go to the hospital. Many of us know the story, half the story, but you had a request, if I remember correctly, a request for pain. You were having some pain, and the pain was more than you could bear. So you made a request for something to manage it that went unaddressed. So I don't know if you want to pick it up from there, if you want to give a little bit more background, but if you could just talk to us about your labor and delivery story.
I think the even prior to that, one of the more a greater detail is the fact that my son was 10 pounds and everybody was aware that he was 10 pounds. Um, this is back during the time where 3D sonogram had just come out.
Okay.
And they do everything based on measurements, and my measurements were so big that they really thought that he was a twin. They thought that he was a twin, and that because he was so big that there was a much smaller baby that they just couldn't see. That turned out not to be true. I share that to say that's just how big he was and how big I was. And so everything about this is not typical. I mean, my stomach is massive. He's huge, he's heavy. And in hindsight, so having a vaginal birth to begin with really should have been off the table. Like, everybody knows that he's at least 10 and a half pounds and he's early. And so as soon as I go into labor, and there are just so many complications, there's just so many, like, in hindsight, so many red flags about, this is not going to be a normal delivery. And I had just delivered a son like 14 months prior to this. So they were literally back to back. So my birthing experience for my first son is still very fresh in my mind, what that was like, and I know no two deliveries are the same, but there are just so many things in this process that's like, look, this is just not normal. I never got an epidural. By the time, someone actually came to do an epidural, we're past that point. It's now too late. And so it's off the table. And so here I am having a vaginal delivery for a child that's at least 10 and a half pounds. Like, we're all aware that this kid is that big, and I've had no pain relief. So I'm about to have a vaginal delivery of a very large baby, completely natural. And that whole process just goes terribly wrong. He's hung in the birth canal for a while, and to the point that the doctors basically come in, because now my husband's there, my ex-husband's there, my mother's there, and they're both frantic because clearly he's not moving. And so my mother is like, why don't we just stop and just go ahead and do a cesarean delivery? And the doctor is like, I'm going to be really honest. He's in the birth canal. So in order to do a cesarean at this point, it would mean that we would need to push him out of the birth canal back up into her stomach. And then we could do a cesarean. However, we need her to sign off saying that we're not responsible for any damages that he suffers from being pushed back up. And so we're like, how are you not liable when you allowed me to go into labor and birth this really large kid? Everybody, so no, you're not liable. So then they come back and they say, we're going to give it one more try. Because at this point, they've tried a vacuum, they tried the forceps, none of it has worked. And so they're like, look, at this point, short of breaking his shoulder, dislocating his shoulder to give you more room, you really got to get this kid out. And the long and short of it is, it happens without having to dislocate his shoulder. He's born, he's in distress, and he's in the NICU for several days. And the long and short of it is, he suffers a traumatic brain injury from that experience that goes undiagnosed until he's about 8.5. So
You mean his traumatic brain injury went undiagnosed for the first 8 years,
8.5 years. So we know he has some developmental delays. So they're evident. We know that he has nerve damage in his right arm, and everybody knows that that nerve damage is directly connected to being hung in the birth canal. So there's no discrepancies around that. What nobody can figure out or seem unable to pinpoint, he was just labeled kind of like LD, just learning disabled for no reason, or other health impaired. Just, he's got delays, but it's not attached to anything.
Right.
And it's not until we saw a developmental pediatrician after waiting 2.5 years. We were on the wait list to see this doctor in our area for 2.5 years. So it took us 2.5 years to get before the doctor. And he decided to do a neuro, based on my birthing story, he decided to do a neuro workup. And in that process, that's how they discovered the traumatic brain injury that had always been there. It had always been there. No one had ever thought to look. He just went completely undiagnosed.
Well, so I thank you for telling that story, because it really just touches on the significant problem that happens even today of women, but especially Black women, just not being heard in the hospital, not having their complaints or concerns during the labor and delivery process really received the way they should be received, or maybe not being taken seriously, or so and this is just another example of that story. And so now, fast forward, it took 8.5 years, and then it took an evaluation by a neuropsychologist, which as an attorney who's a special education attorney, I know that that's significantly different than the traditional school psychologist. So now, Kim, if you could just talk to us about your special education world, in the sense of what made you go from, I'm going to assume that well, let me back up and ask, was your son first evaluated by a school psychologist and you did not like the results or question more of it, and that's why you took him to a neuropsychologist, or what led you to that direction? Okay.
So
Yeah.
I owned a daycare, and Kim actually has an older brother, and that's my son. Has autism. So I have a child with autism on the spectrum, and then I have a child with a traumatic brain injury. So my experience with special education actually started with my older son. And so that experience was crazy. So I have this kid, I'm running a daycare. So as far as milestones, assessments, just keeping up with documentation, being aware of where he should be. I've got all this documentation. And so I reach out to my state's early intervention program, and they come out and they do an assessment, and they tell me that my son is socially and emotionally disturbed, and that we needed to formulate some sort of treatment plan right away. They've got all this stuff. And so I just kind of paused, because one, I feel totally disrespected. I feel disrespected because you're talking to me as if I'm not an educator. You're talking to me as if I don't have a folder full of assessments and work samples, documents, all of this information to inform you of who my child is. And so you come in and you say something far left of what I'm expecting. I'm definitely expecting the word autism to be mentioned. That was not going to be a surprise. But I'm completely floored that you're saying to me that my son is behaviorally and emotionally disturbed. So I go ahead and I schedule the next appointment. In the meantime, I have my son assessed by my insurance provider, using the exact same assessment tool that my state early intervention program uses. So I get his report back, completely different from the state assessment. So just for the sake of not having anyone say, well, my insurance assessment could be biased, because if they found him emotionally disturbed, then that means my insurance company would now be in for all of the treatment that comes along with that. So just to eliminate there being any biases, I now pay out of pocket for another psychologist to assess him, not related to the school system, not related to my insurance company. He doesn't even take my type of insurance, and I pay for it out of pocket using the same tool. The report from my insurance provider and from the private provider are identical. Like all of the, there's some differences, but they basically come to the same conclusion, which is vastly different from the report that I received from the state. And so I say to them the next meeting, if I triangulate this data, there's something wrong. Like there is an assessment that does not line up with the other two assessments. And at this point, I haven't said which assessment that is. And so now they're like, well, which assessment is, far left from the three? Yours. So what you're saying to me about my child is vastly different than other professionals. And what I do know is that my state, like any other state, receives extra funding the more severe the diagnosis of the children are. So I would hate to think that someone is using my son in a process to secure more funding for their programming. I hope that's not what we're experiencing. And of course, now people want to talk to me very intelligently. Now people want to know my academic background. They want to know what I do, what's my previous, none of that should matter.
Right.
None of that should matter. Whether I was a parent with a high school diploma or a parent with a doctoral degree, I should be able to trust that the people that came into my home to assess my child were going to give me a fair and accurate assessment, not set him on a path that has so many implications for his life had I not known that this isn't right. And so from that point on, I've always been extremely leery of special education and services. And so when it came to CAM, I'd already had this experience with my other son. So I'm very proactive. I'm very on top of things. I show up with assessments already done. Like I'm just on top
You're
of
the
it because
parent that probably they don't like.
let me tell you this. They want to not like me, but they can't help but like me because I don't come in to start trouble. I come in to get what I'm supposed to get. Right. I come in to get the free and appropriate public education that IDEA says I'm entitled to. I'm not asking for anything more than that. And as long as we can work together as a team, right. Because by idea, I'm a parent, I'm part of the team, and I have a voice in all final decisions. Nobody can make a decision without my input. We may not agree, but my input, I shouldn't show up and an IEP is already written. That's not how this process is supposed to go.
Well, and you mentioned we started to go into, I think I may have stopped you at the point when you were talking about, what can happen when children might be misdiagnosed and the trajectory that it leads to. And I know you've spoken in the past about the difference between a child in his 12th grade year receiving a diploma versus a certificate of completion, and how that in and of itself can also affect the trajectory of the student going forward post high school. So can you talk a little bit about that and what I'm talking about?
I think one of the most misconceptions or misunderstandings that parents have around special education and an IEP is the fact that your child is working below grade level, right? I think even when we do understand that, we don't understand the impact. And so the example I use is if you have a first grader and your state's course of study says that all first graders are going to learn to rote count from 1 to 100. That simply means they're going to learn how to count from 1 to 100 in order. That's the state standard. That's part of what you have to do to be proficient first grader in math. I'm making that up, but let's just say that's what it is. Then you have a kid with in special education with an IEP, and they determine that based on whatever that child's diagnosis is, that this child is only going to rote count from 1 to 30. And as long as he learns to count from 1 to 30, then he's met his first grade standard for math, right? But that doesn't mean that the counting from 1 to 100 goes away. That just means we're making an exception for you. And eventually you'll learn to count to 100, hopefully, but we're not going to do it in first grade. Well, if you learn below the course of study from kindergarten to 12th grade, you've never met grade level standards. Right. You can't receive a high school diploma, which means you can't go off to community college. There are lots of training programs that you can't get in. It is essentially a lesser type of education. And I do realize that for some students, that option is needed. But I would argue wholeheartedly, based on my experience with hundreds of families and children in my community, that at least 30% of the kids in special education receiving a modified education absolutely do not need one. And that modified education is setting them up for a lifelong trajectory of not being able to have some of the basic things that every person in our society needs. That's the ability to find sustainable employment, the ability to have housing, and for lots of them, even the ability to drive and to be able to get around in your community efficiently. And all of that can be tied back to special education. I know you're an attorney, so I don't have to tell you this, but there's research that says that as many as 70% of the juveniles, of male juveniles, and of course we know they're disproportionately people of color, yeah, that 70% of them have some sort of learning disability or special education diagnosis. 70% of the males in juvenile facilities are part of the special education system. Why and how?
Well, it's interesting you bring that up because that's literally how I got into this world. I used to be a prosecutor. I started out on the adult side for about 5 years, and then I moved over to the juvenile side. And frankly, I didn't know anything about IEPs or any of that until I was a prosecutor in juvenile court, and the courtroom would be filled with parents, grandparents, or both, complaining about the school, having to answer to the judge about truancy issues, or why their child's not doing well. And you just heard over and over again parents saying, the school just calls me every day and they say, come pick them up, we can't handle them, come pick him up. And he has an IEP and they're not following the IEP. So I definitely can attest to, yes, there is almost definitely a disproportionate number of juveniles in juvenile court who have IEPs than don't have IEPs. And that's literally how I got into this world in the first place. For sure.
And it's scary. When I sit and think about how my sons statistically should be on that same trajectory. We all know that they build prisons based on fourth grade standards. I mean, fourth grade statistics. They look at the number of children in certain programming, including special education, certain behavior issues, and they forecast prison systems off of that data. It is completely and should be completely unacceptable in our country. I'm a doctoral student, and right now I'm doing lots of research around, the IEP process. And a study from Johns Hopkins, they had teachers of each ethnicity and gender, and they put them in front of a monitor, a TV monitor, and they tell them, I want you to look at this tape, and I want you to identify any bad or negative behavior that you see happen, right? And so they're going to show them a video of a white male and female. They're going to show them a video of a black male and black female. What the participants in the study don't know is that there's not going to be any bad behavior in the videos, right? What they're actually studying is the eye movement, because they want to see how intently you begin to look for bad behavior based on which subject is on the screen. So there's no bad behavior, but they want to see how in depth you begin to scrutinize the screen, trying to find bad behavior. And to no one's surprise, when Black males and Black females are on the screen, all teachers, Black and white, begin to look more intently for bad behavior. Of course, the Black male subject receives the most intensity. And so just the thought of looking for bad behavior is etched into our education system. I can go back and look at teacher observation forms, and you can see if little Johnny, who's a white male, who's 4 years old, he builds a block, he builds a tower, he knocks it over, and he's just been a boy, constructive, active. Little Daquan can do the exact same thing. And I promise you, the words used to describe the same behavior is entirely different. You'll see words like destructive. You'll see words like aggressive versus his peer is just being a little boy full of energy versus he's considered to be menacing. And so the same language that you see in police reports, you also see in teacher observations.
Yeah.
That is the correlation. So you start calling a child menacing, destructive, aggressive at 4. So when he's in juvenile court, he's menacing, he's destructive and aggressive. And now you've established a pattern. Now you've said or established a pattern where he's always been aggressive. Right. You know, throughout his school history, he's been aggressive. So we're not surprised now that he's got this aggressive behavior. It is a direct correlation between how our children are viewed and the subject and the language used to describe them. Absolutely, absolutely destructive.
Yeah, and then that implicit bias can affect the evaluation, right? So then instead of acknowledging that the Black boy has autism, they may say he has emotional disturbance or conduct disorder or oppositional defiance disorder, which I've learned through research, the perception of those two diagnoses are different on the teacher, and then how the teacher then views the child who's autistic versus who has oppositional defiance disorder.
I've never met a 3-year-old who didn't have opposition defiance disorder, if we want to put it in, in basic terms. And I tell people some of, we always talk about terrible twos. Some of the scariest people on the planet are 4-year-olds.
Yeah.
Because at 4 years
I have that 4-year-old.
Yeah, at 4 years old, you got just enough knowledge to be able to purposely tell a lie.
Yeah.
You now have enough balance and agility to get away. Right? And you can think a little clearer about your actions. So you're able to manipulate emotions. Mm-hmm. A 4-year-old is one of the most dangerous things on this planet. So I ran a daycare for years. They all have opposition defiance disorder. There's some just more sweeter, so I'm just saying it's all in your perception of the terminology. You know what I mean? Like based on the core terms of what that disorder is, all kids have a season in their life where they're defiant. So it's like, come on now. There is a very distinct difference between having some traits or having a season in your life. Yeah. And really having the core constructs that is part of who you are. They are not one and in the same. And I think just to be fair, if you aggravate a teacher enough, she can't see the positive about you. And that's not because you are a bad child. You just may be more difficult than some of the other students in the room. Right. That all has to be taken into consideration. If, like, at one point in time, when I downsized and I had like a home daycare, I had all little girls. So I got 10 kids in this daycare. I have all little girls and I got one little boy. Compared to the behaviors of the little girls in the classroom, he's a handful. That doesn't make him a bad child. He's a 3-year-old boy, and he's literally being a 3-year-old boy in comparison to the 3-year-old girls that I have, most of whom are fairly calm, fairly docile. And they all want to be his mama, so they all tell him what to do. So they're aggravating him. You know what I mean? They're aggravating him. So he's doing his thing based on. But I took all of that into context when I'm writing his assessments and talking to his mother. Yeah. I would flat out tell her, like, he was, aggressive one day, he was pushing. So I tell both parents about the pushing. His mother is overly concerned because he pushed a little girl. And I said, I'm gonna tell you the truth. She nagged him all day long. Doesn't make it right. But they're 3. Do you follow me? Like, yeah. She nagged him on the swing. She fussed at him for not tying his shoes. He wouldn't be still during that time. She gonna tell him what to. So finally he had enough. And he pushed her. There is a correct disciplinary action that goes with that. But I didn't see him all of a sudden as this aggressive, menacing little boy. I saw him as a little boy who had been henpicked all day long. And so when she snatched his blanket, he pushed her. End of story. End of story. That simple.
Yeah. Well, and the context and really being, it's sort of taking a step back, right? And being honest about what you're really witnessing as a whole is important. And I think that gets lost in the shuffle of education. I think the teachers are very, especially once the child is going from one grade to the next, right? Because on day one, all the teacher has is the IEP and doesn't have any context. So then once again comes the implicit bias behind how you believe someone is going to behave, and then right, anything that sort of correlates to that is just going to sort of validate that perception, and you think then validate the IEP.
And unless your child goes in a classroom with a very open-minded and very understanding teacher, your child never gets a clean slate from one year to the next. And I tell parents that
Yeah.
because anything that the last year teacher made an official record of, from behavior to attitude to disciplinary actions, it's all in that same folder.
Hmm.
So unless as an educator, I have the ability to look at it, take it for what it's worth, but not build an immediate perception of the student based on what happened last year, your kid very seldom comes into a new classroom with a clean slate. And that's very, very unfortunate because some educators will take everything that's in that folder and immediately shape an idea around a kid, never thinking that maybe last year that teacher just didn't use best practices that work best with that particular student.
Yep.
Like we always put all of the onus on the student. Well, you're the professional, and I can say that because I'm an educator.
Mhm.
You're the professional. Whose job is it to create an environment of success? Is it the student's job or is it the educator's job?
Right.
And when one option or one avenue doesn't work, how intently do you really work to construct that process? I say that at the same time, understanding that educators have a ton on their plate.
Hmm.
And so I don't make those statements without also engaging the parent. I will say to a parent, there are some things that are a parent's job and there are some things that are an educator's job. And so if we both do our jobs, the likelihood of some of these behaviors diminishing will happen. I'm not saying it's a cure with all, but if we are a team and we've identified how I'm going to support you as the educator and how you as the educator are going to support me as a parent, there are some things we absolutely can address and get a handle over, and that doesn't happen a lot. Every, every parent has to have an education plan, and that education plan identifies the long-term learning that you want your kid to have. We look at them as children, forgetting that one day they're going to be adults. And so when you look at this kid years later as an adult, what impact should the education that he received have produced? And so I use Cam as an example. His four concepts around education are having basic lifestyle skills. He needs to be able to cook, clean, bathe, take care of himself in the very basic sense. That's part of his education because education should far supersede math, arithmetic, reading, and social studies. It should supersede that. So being able to take care of himself, basic life skills training, being able to earn an income. All of his education is designed that at the end of the day, he's going to be able to take care of himself. His education should help foster his sense of being an active and supportive part of his community. So he needs to have an awareness of how to give back. He needs to have an awareness of how to use his influence, his time to impact others who aren't as fortunate. And so those are like the three things that I build his education around. And so in that process, I expect school to work the same way. I've got these long-term goals for this kid. Education is designed to work that same way. So I absolutely manage it. I will come in to an IEP meeting. They learn the hard way. I don't show up and y'all have goals written out. That's not how this gonna work. So you might as well have this IEP blank when I get here because if I get here and goals are written out, we can get along or we cannot get along.
Yeah.
But you're not going to shove an IEP down my throat. I shouldn't get here and all the things are filled out. and we're simply just reviewing it. And that's most parents' experience. They
It
come
is.
into an IEP that's done, and the school will say you were an active participant, because they will go line by line through the IEP with you and say, well, what do you think about that? Knowing that you don't have the insight to disagree.
Right.
You don't have the insight to be able, when they say that Johnny will be able to effectively identify verbs, 3 out of 5 occurrences, or whatever other jargon they use, you don't have the ability to be like, no, I think it should be 4 out of, like, you just typically don't.
Right.
They're anticipating that. So you simply nod and agree. And at the end, you sign off on an IEP that was pre-prepared before you got there. Well, we're not doing that. Y'all might as well buckle up. I'm gonna bring some drinks and snacks, because we're gonna be here a good 2-3 hours while we write these goals in this IEP plan.
And those goals are always still centered around the 3 larger goals that you have for him.
Always,
Okay.
always, always, always. And so it's just all about what you want to focus on. Absolutely. You can pay Mr. Jim $20 an hour to tie your shoes, and he'd gladly do it. Mr. Cam, your shoes untied.
But just to kind of, I just want to dial in just to make it very clear. So when you were in the IEP meeting, creating goals, and your goal is to make sure that he understands the profit and loss statement. So then what does that look like what did that look like for you in the IEP meeting? How did they write that out? Was he like, you
Well,
want to take certain classes or?
so to be very clear, that's why I share that I see education is very fluid. I realized that there were certain things that he wasn't going to get from a public education. And it didn't matter if he had an IEP or if he didn't have an IEP. There are just some concepts, some things that he's not going to learn in a typical public school. So 4th grade, we didn't do school at all. Cam ran his coffee shop Monday through Friday from 8 to 3. He did homeschool on Wednesday with another homeschool family, but he literally worked a job in the 4th grade from 8 to 3. It wasn't my idea. I can't even take credit for it. He asked. That was it. He started 4th grade right when he had opened like his first full-time coffee shop. We had a part-time coffee shop. We were only open 3 days a week. And so he worked in that coffee shop 2 days a week. He was in a private school for kids with disabilities. I worked it out with the school where he was given credit, certain educational credits for his time working in the shop, because he was running the cash register. So they gave him credit for math. And he was writing lots of our recipes and helping me to write like the procedures for the shop. So they also gave him English credit. So he got English credit and math credit from working in the shop, because all this ties back into my plan about him being able to take care of himself. So his education has to support that. So the school agreed and they gave him credit for those things. So the following year, we opened our first full-time location, and he asked me if he could work full-time instead of going to school. And after I thought about it, we agreed. We agreed to allow him to not go to school. So we did all the paperwork with our state to be an official homeschool. In our state, nobody tells you what you have to teach in a homeschool. You have to have a calendar, and you have to do testing at the end of the year. Whether they pass or fail, you have to do testing, standardized testing. So those are the only requirements in my state. So that means I constructed homeschool around employment, and he worked 4 days a week, and that was his education. And so I caught flack from people. They'd be like, "Oh, you're an educator. Do you feel like it was the right thing to do to let him miss, the 4th grade?" And I said, when I think about my son's trajectory, his life, he has some things that work against him, that he may not ever be able to go off to college. I don't know. He may not ever be able to do some things that the typical young adult can. So it's my job to give him as much of a leg up in being able to be an adult who's productive in society and who's able to create an income for himself as possible. And when I sit down and I look at the course of study for 4th graders in our state, they learn state capitals, they learn our state board, they learn all our state facts. And not that it's not important, but I've never been asked any of those things in a job interview.
Right.
I learned all 50 state capitals as a fourth grader in this state. I remember 10 at best. So to see him manage his team, to see him greet his customers, to see him run a cash register, to see him be very incremental in a business, to me is absolutely more beneficial than some of the things he would have gained in a fourth grade classroom. And so I do it again. I do it again, and I wouldn't think twice about it.
And
The
so then,
following year,
oh, go ahead. Yep.
go ahead.
No, that's what I was gonna ask you then. Once you then transition him back, how did you make sure that those, whatever the measurable goals were still in line with your education plan?
The following year, a charter school opened up in my city whose focus was entrepreneurship. And so I went to that school. And it wasn't a school just for kids with disabilities like his prior school. I went to that school and I basically brokered the same deal. He went to school 3 days a week. He worked in the coffee shop 2 days a week. They gave him credit for his math class and they gave him credit for the entrepreneur segment of the school's charter. They gave him credit for the entrepreneurship class by working in the shop. And in fact, he did some of the teaching for the entrepreneurship class because none of the teachers had ever been entrepreneurs.
Oh,
And so here's this kid sitting in class. So whenever they would ask questions, his viewpoint was totally different. He had viewpoint as a young adult, and he had a viewpoint as someone running a business day to day. And so that's what we did for. That was last year. No, that was 2019, 2020, pre-pandemic. When the pandemic hit, we went back to homeschooling because he was going to be sixth grade. He was going to be in front of the screen, and he had 6 classes, 3 of which didn't align with my education plan.
mhm.
He had an online gym class. I'm not knocking gym class. It's just, online is a little different. And so I opted to pull him out so we could focus on the areas that benefit him the most. So he currently has an English language arts tutor that he works with. He's in an online math class. Then he also has a speaking coach. He's learning to pitch because he's going to enter pitch competitions for his business next year. So he has a speaking coach where he's learning to pitch, and then he runs his business the rest of the time. Those are the only 3 things I feel like we need currently. And so that's what we're doing.
Oh, very nice, very nice. And we've kind of talked on the periphery about this business. I have ordered some of the coffee, but this is a coffee. Well, it's Cam's coffee, but you also do sell like teas and other merchandise. Why don't you
Mhm.
talk about the business?
So I'm super excited about Cam's business. What was intended to be a hobby for him um, has grown into something that has impacted our community in ways I never could have imagined. Sticking true to my core education concepts for him of being able to take care of himself. Cam's Coffee started as just a coffee stand on the weekend for him to work on the nerve damage he had in that one arm, to work on math and reading. It was really intended to be like this education thing and to boost his confidence because he had suffered so much loss over the last couple of years related to school. And so it was intended to be something just for him. I figured we'd do it a few weekends and we would move on with our lives. I asked a girlfriend if he could come into her hair salon on Saturdays and just sell coffee to her staff and the ladies getting their hair done. And she agreed. So I set up this little meeting. I made him negotiate his little deal with her, not knowing that we've already negotiated this deal. She has him sign a contract. So he has this business. I go in and I talk to the ladies working there and explain to him what we're really trying to do. And if you could just encourage him. If you don't understand him, ask him to repeat himself, just things to support him. And so just a tidbit, off subject, but that is an example that I share with parents, that lots of times when you don't have what you needed, there were certain therapies that weren't available in my area at the time. So I essentially created therapy for him. Like, this is what he needs. It's not available in my community. I'm gonna let these other moms in this shop help encourage my boy to work on his speech and give them little tricks that we all can do and say to him to get him to enunciate and do the things he needs to do.
And even
Um,
if it is available in your area, if you're like, I know for me and my son who needed speech, I have insurance, but the copay was so outrageous. Like
yes,
they said, we have never seen a copay this high before. And at that point, I was like, I'm not paying this high copay when I know, his dad and I will work with him consistent. So there are definitely other way. I agree with you. Even whether you have it or don't have it, sometimes you have to think outside of the box and do it a different way.
create what you need. Your speech pathologist or your speech therapist at school will gladly tell you the things that you can work on at home and implement them. Tell your mother that when she's keeping the grandbaby, this is what he's working on in speech. I mean, literally we had family meetings, especially with my son with autism. Okay, this is what we're working on this month. From my mom, my dad, my brother, my friends, this is what we're working on. When you see this behavior, I need you to say this. Nobody says no.
No.
Nobody says, I'm not going to help you.
Right.
They gladly help you.
Yep.
And so Cam decided that he wanted to have a business that he could help hire people like himself. And so that's what we did. We went down this path to figure out, hey, we knew nothing about coffee. His coffee stand was a Keurig machine and K-cups. So if you wanted a latte, we got out the K-cup that said latte. We put it in there. We put some whipped cream on it and he drizzled some caramel on top.
No.
And ta-da, you had a latte. Like that was the extent of this little coffee pop-up stand. But once he made up his mind that this is what he wanted to do, like we just kind of rallied behind him. So today, he's got his own line of coffee, tea, and coffee based care products. Prior to COVID, we did operate a fully functional coffee stand. We offered a coffee stand, coffee shop that employed 8 individuals with disabilities. Currently now we are just shipping nationwide. So we ship our products nationwide. And even in this process, to your point, COVID made us sit down and really think how we were showing up as an employer and thinking through what impact did we really want to have on our community and what message did we want to send to the rest of the country. So we're kind of restructuring ourselves. We are committed to creating 100 jobs by 2025. Oh, wow. And the way that we do that is that we're moving into the e-commerce space and the warehousing and manufacturing side of coffee, because we realize that I don't think people understand that when you run a coffee shop, you're selling items $5 at a time. A coffee and a muffin, it's $8 or $10 at a time. It takes a lot of volume and time to really have an impact when you're mission driven.
Yeah.
And there's a ton of overhead that comes with that.
Mm-hmm.
So thinking through, okay, how can we have more impact and create jobs that pay an even higher wage? And how can we have longevity? How can we create jobs that people with disabilities can work for a long phase in their lives and find independence? And so we're restructuring ourselves to be able to do that still through coffee and tea. And so this year, 2021, we're hoping to be able to open a warehousing operation and employ our first 5 to 6 people, bring our team back to work, as well as have a small retail kind of space up front. Oh, and so that's like our ambition for 2021.
Oh, that's very nice. And employment of people with disabilities and substantive jobs and doing substantive roles is a significant issue. I mean, there are many people who rely on disability as their way of living and to pay the bills. So to actually or if they are employed, it could be taking out the trash or something menial, and so to actually have real true gainful employment is, I know, a very, very big deal. So this is tremendous what Cam is doing with his coffee, and it's coffee, tea. I think you even sell mugs and t-shirts, like different merchandise that says Cam's Coffee. Absolutely. On it. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And the coffee is fair trade, sustainable. source. That's,
Yes.
I always look for that. That's so I love it. So I definitely want to make sure to put that out there. It's fair trade and sustainably sourced.
Absolutely. We're trying to be even more intentional with our supply chain and figuring out, how can we connect with more minority owned businesses or women led operations, or operations that are mission driven, even throughout our supply chain. And it can be difficult, it can be challenging, to find the balance. But we've spent the last couple of months inside because we do quarantine. But it's given us lots of time to think and reflect about, how we want to show up. We live in a state where piecemeal employment is still allowed. And piecemeal employment is where, if I opened a nonprofit and I said that I was going to teach individuals with disabilities job skills, and that job skill required them to put pieces together, that instead of paying them an hourly wage, I could pay them by the piece. So you could work 8 hours and maybe still only make $20 or $30, because in that 8 hours, it took you so long to put so many pieces together.
Okay.
We live in North Carolina, and North Carolina is one of 5 states, I believe, that still allows piecemeal payment. And so there's so many things like we're fighting to bring awareness to, and to encourage other employers to be inclusive. And not just in the menial aspects of your operation, but how do you make sure there's fair wages for everybody, that
Yeah.
there's opportunity for growth for everybody. And so that's a message that we focused on and we're working on, spreading through our social media.
Oh, very nice. Very nice. Well, Latasha, this was a really great talk. I really enjoyed my time. I'm so glad that we're able to get together and you're able to come on today. If you could also give the information, the website for the coffee.
Sure. Our website is shop.camscoffeeco.com. So that's shop.camscoffeeco.com.
All right. It was great having you on today.
I really appreciate the opportunity to come on and share and have a conversation with you.
Thank you.